and sorry to cut short everyone's lunch. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to this very important conference. I know our chair, Lena Khan, greatly enjoyed meeting BEUC and TACD colleagues in Brussels earlier this year, and I'm happy to be here continuing our relationship with civil society across the Atlantic. Rethinking consumer protection in the digital age is the theme of our conference, and I think it's an apt one. The Federal Trade Commission has been around for more than 100 years, and while our mission to safeguard fair markets and protect consumers has been a constant, there have been important moments in our history when the agency has rethought how we approach our work. The rise of the digital economy may prove to be one such inflection point, and I think to understand it, we need to look back to the last major shift, 4 decades ago in the early 1980s. The history of the FTC in the early 80s was in many ways a microcosm of what was happening in the United States at large, as Ronald Reagan and a new breed of economic thinkers took power in Washington. These champions of neoclassical economics ushered in a fundamental shift in how we view markets and government's role in them. I see that shift most crisply articulated in the FTC's 1980 policy statement on unfairness, which articulates when the FTC will use its authority to challenge harmful business practices as unfair, which of course has been a key theme of this conference. Here's a key line from the FTC's 1980 statement. Quote, "Normally we expect the marketplace to be self-correcting, and we rely on consumer choice, the ability of individual consumers to make their own private purchasing decisions without regulatory intervention to govern the market. We anticipate that consumers will survey the available alternatives, choose those that are most desirable, and avoid those that are inadequate or unsatisfactory." The statement goes on to acknowledge that certain sales techniques can inhibit consumer choice and therefore be challenged as unfair. But the core assumptions in this statement are noteworthy. First, that marketplaces can essentially self-regulate, and second, that consumers themselves are in the best position to avoid harm by evaluating products and services on their own. There's no doubt that there can be truth here. Competitive, well-functioning markets generate massive benefits for consumers as well as for workers and honest businesses. But 4 decades on, I think it is time to re-examine whether these are assumptions that we can continue to rely on. For example, it seems self-evident that our experience since 1980 has exposed the folly that markets do not require meaningful oversight. Deregulation in the US in the 1980s contributed to a savings and loan crisis and then a recession in the early 90s. Just as the failure of federal banking regulators to crack down on predatory mortgage lending contributed in the early 2000s to the deepest recession since the Great Depression, something that ultimately affected, of course, the whole world. I suppose that we argue that these disasters actually proved the policy statement right. Markets corrected themselves. But these corrections caused devastation for millions of families, and massive taxpayer bailouts were required in both instances. In my view, it makes no sense for the government, charged with protecting the public, to sit on the sidelines, allowing consumer harms to accrue in the belief or the hope that the market will eventually correct itself. Stated more simply, if these crises were what was meant by markets being self-correcting, I think we can do better. I'll spend the rest of my remarks focusing on the second assumption embedded in the 1980 policy statement, that consumers can largely protect themselves by carefully evaluating different products and services. Again, a topic that we've discussed quite extensively today. No doubt there are areas where this may be true, but in today's digital economy, it is simply illogical to put the onus on individuals to appreciate the implications of this enormously complex ecosystem, an ecosystem powered by massive data collection and often arcane technology. Today, I'll touch briefly on 4 areas where the digital economy is generating persistent harms to consumers: commercial surveillance, the proliferation of algorithms with unintended consequences, review manipulation, and dark patterns. I'll discuss how the FTC under Chair Khan is working to tackle these challenges by reimagining and reinvigorating our tools, rather than relying on economic assumptions that have failed us repeatedly in the real world. I'll start by discussing commercial surveillance. Today, as we all know, the collection, aggregation, and onward disclosure of personal data underpins nearly every transaction in the economy. This pervasive commercial surveillance and our surveillance-based economy impose very real costs on individuals, including financial harm, discrimination, exploitation of children, and a chilling effect on our ability to exercise our civil liberties. As explained by the TACD in its 22 resolution on banning surveillance-based advertising, these harms are especially acute for communities of color, people with disabilities, and other marginalized communities. In the United States, the traditional approach to combating these harms has been notice and choice, providing consumers with notice of what information is being collected and a choice as to whether they want to continue engaging with the service. This approach accords with the 1980 policy statement, the view that consumers, armed with the right information, can protect themselves. It should be clear by now that this approach is not working. Even if notices were perfectly understandable, a rare feat, they may, and often do, simply inform consumers that the company collects anything and everything it can and can do with it whatever it wants. And the entity giving notice oftentimes is only one of dozens or even hundreds of companies that are collecting, aggregating, and monetizing our data behind the scenes. To be clear, notice is indispensable, and we fully expect companies to be transparent. But a privacy regime that relies on notice alone places too much burden on consumers, who simply don't have the time and expertise to review lengthy privacy notices for every service they use, especially when companies routinely change these notices at will. Choice, the second part of the notice and choice regime, is similarly plagued by paradox. The choice of whether to accept a company's one-sided terms of service or forgo the service altogether is not a choice at all. It's unlikely that anyone here is going to opt out of booking an airline reservation, conducting a job search, or connecting with friends and colleagues on social media. We should not be asking consumers to choose between participating in the digital economy or protecting their privacy. To respond to these serious challenges, the FTC is using every tool we have to limit harmful commercial surveillance. This summer, for the first time in our history, we launched a rulemaking to seek public input on commercial surveillance practices, an initiative that we hope also lends momentum to Congress's efforts to pass comprehensive privacy legislation. Rulemakings take time, but in the meantime, we are laser focused on preventing some of the worst harm stemming from surveillance. Last month, we brought a major suit in federal court against one of the country's leading data aggregators, who we alleged sold precise geolocation data that could reveal a person's visit to a health clinic, worship at a church, synagogue, or mosque, or stay at an addiction recovery center. We are also strengthening the suite of remedies we seek in our law enforcement actions, including the FTC's first ever data minimization requirement, our first ever requirement to offer consumers multi-factor authentication options, and our first ever requirement to destroy any algorithms trained on data illegally collected from children. The FTC is making clear that companies cannot violate our privacy with impunity. Another set of harms closely tied to the surveillance economy, and again, a major topic of discussion today, are those harms generated by unfair algorithms. Many of these algorithms are powered by the very data collection we nominally consent to on a daily basis. If the assumptions embedded in the 1980 policy statement are to be credited, we might see the proliferation of artificial intelligence as an unmitigated good that should continue unchecked, because surely the market will ensure the benevolent use of AI. The report the FTC just issued on combating online harms through innovation, however, tells a very different story, as did many of the panelists we heard from earlier. Our report talks about how the unfettered use of algorithms can result in harms to consumers, including discrimination against protected classes and exposure to reams of incendiary and fraudulent content. How are consumers supposed to evaluate and not navigate these opaque processes, as the 1980 statement would presume? The answer, of course, is they cannot. As the EU considers the important fairness considerations underlying the AI Act, I know that this is top of mind for many of you. And it is top of mind for the FTC, as shown by our recent work not only on this report, but also in enforcement actions like Curbo and Everalbum, which prevented companies from using ill-gotten data to feed their algorithms. Another persistent problem that challenges the assumptions of the 1980s is deceptive online reviews. Deceptive and fake reviews deeply distort online commerce. They can confuse and deceive consumers and can cheat honest businesses who don't rely on fake reviews, but are forced to compete with those who do. And these ill effects can be amplified on e-commerce platforms whose algorithms promote products that are nominally well-reviewed. This plague of fake reviews is a rebuke to the assumptions embedded in the 1980 policy statement. First, it is clear that online marketplaces are simply not up to the task of governing themselves. Indeed, while these platforms claim they are doing everything they can to root out this problem, fake reviews continue to proliferate. And I believe this scourge is fueled by the incentives platforms create through their algorithms and their very business models. Second, it is self-evident that consumers cannot survey the available alternatives, and that's a quote from the statement, and choose those that are most desirable when the marketplace is shot through with commercial misinformation. To address these deep distortions, the FTC is working to increase deterrence across the marketplace. Last year, deploying a new strategy, we issued more than 700 notices of penalty offenses, warning firms that they could face significant civil penalties for engaging in deceptive review practices. And when companies engage in such practices and they get caught, we take aggressive action. We recently secured a $4.2 million judgment against Fashion Nova for engaging in alleged review suppression, as well as a $3.5 million judgment against a firm that posted reviews by compensated reviewers who were masquerading as independent customers. Just last month, we joined with 6 U.S. states to sue the rental platform Roomster, which we charged with polluting its site with fake reviews. As we work to confront this scourge, we are learning from our partners overseas who are on the forefront of this work. The final persistent problem I will highlight are dark patterns, the subject of an FTC staff report titled Bringing Dark Patterns to Light. As the FTC's report and BEUC's recent report on dark patterns explains, dark patterns are design practices that trick or manipulate consumers into making harmful choices they would not otherwise have made, including and especially around their privacy. Our report identifies different types of dark patterns and lays out important design principles to avoid them in the first place. Let's be clear. The proliferation of digital dark patterns collides head-on with the assumptions in the 1980 policy statement. Simply put, relying on companies to voluntarily abandon deceptive practices is not a viable strategy, given how these practices can fuel profits. Nor can we count on consumers to protect themselves from techniques that are often scientifically engineered to manipulate them. We don't expect consumers to evaluate for themselves whether their food is laden with toxins, and we shouldn't expect them to fend for themselves when it comes to digital tricks and traps. The FTC is aggressively cracking down on these dark patterns, making clear that the responsibility for preventing harm rests not with consumers, but with the firms that deploy these dark patterns. Earlier this month, for the first time, we expressly alleged that a major financial services provider, Credit Karma, deployed digital dark patterns to trick consumers into believing they'd been pre-approved for credit, when they had not been. Notably, the FTC settlement will compensate consumers whose time may have been wasted by these practices, a recognition that consumers can suffer in ways that are not limited to direct monetary loss. The FTC's order also requires Credit Karma to maintain for 20 years its records of A/B testing, clickstream analysis, and similar evidence of how the design choices play to consumers. This will help ensure that the company does not deploy deceptive dark patterns in the future and will send a clear message to other firms that are considering engaging in similar tactics. As with commercial surveillance, AI, and fake reviews, the FTC is making clear that we will not stand idly by as the harms from dark patterns proliferate in our economy. I've discussed 4 areas of particular concern for the FTC, but this is far from an exhaustive list. Across the board, our approach under Chair Khan has been to rethink, retool, refashion, but also to build on the important policy and enforcement work that the agency has done for decades. We are doing so in a clear-eyed way that relies not on rosy assumptions about self-correcting markets, but on rigorous analysis of where harms exist and how we can confront them. We know that we're not alone. We greatly value continued dialogue with civil society organizations like BEUC and the work that you have undertaken on behalf of consumers for 6 decades. We also value continued dialogue with our transatlantic government partners, who are confronting many of the same consumer protection issues that we are. To that end, earlier this year, we launched an informal dialogue on consumer protection with Commissioner Reinders. That dialogue is addressing many of the topics I've discussed, and I know it's just one of many ways we are working together to confront emerging threats to consumers. I look forward to continuing this critical conversation in the months and years to come. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Sam. Now, we have another panel, but if we have 1 or 2 quick questions, we'll take advantage of Sam's presence. Anyone have a question? Anything burning you want to put to Sam? Agustin has a question. Of course.
So are you saying that the FTC is engaging in really a generational change in thinking?
I think all of us are engaging in a generational change in thinking. We know that a lot of the economic assumptions that U.S. policymakers were making in the 1980s were being made in other countries as well. I think about the UK in particular and the rise of Margaret Thatcher. I think all of us need to carefully, re-examine our assumptions, which I think is what we're doing at this conference, and consider whether the policies we're undertaking to protect consumers in this digital age continue to work. And as we survey the economic landscape and we survey the many harms that consumers are facing, I do think it's clear that we need to rethink our approach, and I think that's reflected in the actions the Commission has taken over the last year and a half.
And, yep, sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. I wanted to ask you, do you think you also need new law? Because, in Europe, we always tend to have new law, and we discussed that. In the US, I know it's much more difficult to have new law passed, but do you think it is needed, and if yes, on which topic in particular?
Which what?
On which topic in particular you think new law should be adopted in the US in the different area you have mentioned?
It's an important point to make. So, one thing, for those of you not familiar with the FTC, we rely on a statute that is 100 years old. The consumer protection provision of it is about 90 years old. And all the statute says, I'm simplifying only slightly, is that unfair or deceptive practices in commerce are prohibited. And it's upon that foundation that the whole edifice of our consumer protection agenda has been built. It's a great law. It gives us a lot of flexibility, but there are also constraints on the extent we can use that law to confront some of the emerging problems that we're discussing at this conference. The Commission has repeatedly urged Congress, the people's elected representatives, to pass, for example, comprehensive privacy legislation and to strengthen our remedial toolkit so we can ensure that we can hold companies accountable that are breaking the law. We're hopeful. We heard about some of the progress that Congress is making on privacy legislation, but you're absolutely right that if we're really going to confront these challenges, we need an active FTC, but also a Congress that's willing to take actions and pass laws to protect the public.
Mike?
We have time?
Look.
Just a question about your reflections on the mainstream thinking in economic policy in the US. And of course, you know, the new FTC is bringing a lot of very fresh ideas. To what extent do you think that you'll be able to materialize that work in view of how the current thinking, you know?
I'm having trouble.
Sorry. How will we be able to materialize, you know, that work, you know, taking into account the state of the courts in the U.S.?
Well, we have to be very rigorous about it. We have to show our work. We have to have the evidence. And that's why I said, you know, we're very intentionally relying on rigorous analysis, not economic theories. And if you look at what we've been able to accomplish, I think in particular in the last 18 months, I think we are delivering on a lot of this agenda, whether it's reforming our rulemaking procedures, which is not something I talked about, but is quite important, and then kicking off of privacy rulemaking, whether it's actually getting the first collection restrictions in some of our orders. I referenced the data minimization requirements that we're now including in our orders. We brought a privacy case where we actually named the CEO. Again, I believe that was the first time we'd ever done that. We've gotten orders, including in a children's privacy case, to destroy algorithms that were built on ill-gotten data collected from children. So we are putting into practice, I think, what we're saying. You're absolutely right, it's going to be challenging, and we're going to continue to bring the same rigor to our work that has allowed us to realize the victories we've realized today.
Thank you, Sam, and
Thank
thanks
you.
for taking those extra questions as well.
Thank
Big round
you.
of applause. Thank you.